So welcome everyone to this session on climate and conflict-induced migration and labour exploitation, understanding the risks and taking responsible action, which is part of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment 2023, organised by the IHRB and AIM Progress. My name is Louise Herring. I'm Executive Director of AIM Progress, which is a collaborative forum of 45 fast-moving consumer goods companies working together to positively impact people's lives and increase respect for human rights in our collective supply chains. As an individual, I wanted to introduce myself and explain that I'm someone who's worked with companies on business and human rights and modern slavery for a number of years. But I'd also acknowledge that the world is changing very rapidly and that conflict and climate change are having a dramatic impact on so many people globally, on so many people's lives, and exposing them to vulnerabilities which we all need to understand better and know how to respond to. So I'm really delighted to facilitate the panel today and to be joined by 4 experts who can talk about this topic and we talk about what organisations, businesses and individuals need to be doing to manage these changing risks. So I'm going to hand over now to those individuals so they can introduce themselves, tell you why they're passionate about this topic. So I'm going to start please with Anna. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Trippenell. I'm the founder of Human Level. So a little bit about my background and why I think this topic is incredibly important, and I'm really pleased we're chatting about it. Some of you know that I had the enviable position of leaving the law firm to work with John Ruggie on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And what I speak less about is that in parallel to that work, I was also working as a human rights lawyer in conflict and post-conflict countries based out of Kenya and then Cote d'Ivoire and Libya. And I saw firsthand the connections between climate change, drought, resource shortage and conflict. And even though it was early days in making the connection, anyone who was working on conflict knew that part of the root, of that conflict was the change in climate. And today, I'm working with companies on human rights due diligence and the UNGPs. But really 3 years ago, I had that aha moment working after doing the Cambridge course that all of the human rights issues that I'm working on with companies, all of them will get worse with time because of the rapidly warming climate. So when we say that climate change is the biggest human rights challenge of our time, that is absolutely true. And so that's why at Human Level, we've made it our mission to build knowledge of the interconnections, weekly listserv, content help, all of that for free, as well as working with companies, of course, but really just to get the word out on what needs to happen. So thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, my name is Nicole Muns, and I'm a director at Justice and Care, running an international systemic change team. We are, as an NGO, focused more broadly on modern slavery and helping to identify victims and bring about justice and systemic change in the response to modern slavery. But quite specifically, we've been looking recently at the connection between conflict and climate change. Induced migration and trying to understand how it affects modern slavery and the risks it imposes for migrants in that area. I'm particularly interested in this because climate and conflict are becoming increasing drivers of migration. Those that are impacted by conflict and climate-induced migration are already a very vulnerable group, and forced migration heightens this risk. So it's a really concerning trend, something that we need to be really aware of and understand better if we're to respond more effectively. Thank you again to Louise for the opportunity to be here today.
Great, thanks Nicole. Pablo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Pablo Silvano. I am a regional thematic specialist on migration, environment and climate change at the International Organization for Migration. And I cover the Americas and the Caribbean. IOM is a UN-related organization with 175 member states, and it was one of the first organizations to really look at the nexus between migration, environment, and climate change, because the member states understood that these trends were going to shape the future of the present and the future of human mobility. And I'm personally fascinated about the very different ways in which climate change and disasters and environmental degradation affect the way people move in our region, right? And the many diverse ways in which it affects their well-being, but also the way in which migration can offer solutions to some of the major challenges of our time. Thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you, Pablo. And finally, Rachel, welcome.
Thank you very much, Louise, for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Rachel Rigby, and I've worked for about 20 years on labor rights and human rights in global supply chains, from within the US government first, and then also with NGOs. And like the other panelists, I started to realize over time how important it is not to work on these human rights and labor rights issues in a siloed way, but to really acknowledge the underlying causes of those abuses related to climate change and land degradation so that we can really tackle root causes in a systemic way. I currently lead our human rights work at Rainforest Alliance, which is a global organization working at the intersection of business, agriculture, and forests for over 30 years. We run a global agricultural certification program that reaches about 5,000 companies and 4 million farmers and farm workers. We also implement over 60 projects to complement our certification program in many production and forestry landscapes, working with farmers and forest communities to improve livelihoods and protect nature. Our sectors of focus are coffee, tea, and fruits, as well as some key forest risk commodities like cocoa, palm oil, and forest products. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you to all of our panelists for your introductions. So, Nicole, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, please. Your recent research paper used the term distress, migration, and displacement. So, could you talk us through, from your perspective, how you think climate and conflict is changing patterns of migration globally, and what your research has found in terms of how that is in turn changing patterns of labour exploitation?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Louise. So climate change and armed conflict are becoming increasingly relevant drivers of significant increase in forced migration. So the numbers of migrants forcibly displaced or distressed displacement within and across borders has nearly doubled in the last 10 years, reaching its highest level since World War II. And importantly, the rate of forced migration due to these factors has significantly outpaced population growth. So it's becoming a bigger problem and is likely to continue for the reasons that I'm sure we'll be exploring together today. This has important consequences for the risk of trafficking and labour exploitation. Individuals forced to migrate due to conflict and climate change come mostly from lower and middle income nations. And they're already living with poor economic conditions, which makes them inherently vulnerable. Conflict and climate change induced migration compounds these pre-existing vulnerabilities, and particularly when migration is entered into suddenly as a result of conflict and climate. Conflict, really the reason why there is that additional area of vulnerability associated with that suddenness and conflict and climate-induced migration is because typically migrants are isolated from family and community networks. They have limited opportunities for income generation in their new destinations, limited access to government support, legal and labour protection in transit and destination countries. And in the case of protracted displacement, which is actually becoming more common, these migrants are more prone to desperation and as a result of the lack of opportunities. So what happens also in instances of disaster, for example, environmental disaster induced by climate change and sudden onset conflict, is that government support and law enforcement systems that even in normal times can be quite stretched, become quickly overwhelmed in these times and leave many of the population unprotected. So there's a number of things that come together to combine to compound already existing vulnerabilities within these low and middle income countries, poor circumstances in which these migrants are coming from. Yet the circumstances of conflict and climate-induced migration compounds and exacerbates all of these risks.
Great, thank you so much. And Pablo, if I can come to you, can you talk to us with your perspective, which is specifically about the Americas? What are you seeing in terms of changes in patterns and changes in exploitation?
Right. Thank you very much. And that was a great introduction to the topic from Nicole. And I guess, I mean, where we come from in the Americas is that migration is often a traditional feature of societies, right? Both internal and international migration. But we do join, I guess, Nicole's approach in saying that, climate hazards in particular, but also environmental hazards at large, affect the way people move, right, and affect the conditions in which they move. The new data on internal displacement was just released yesterday, so this is very timely, and it noted that it recorded 60.9 million new displacements worldwide due to conflict and disaster, right? Which is a very high, I think, the highest figure in the latest years. In the Americas, we're talking about 2.1 million new disaster displacements and 500,000 displacement due to conflict and violence. So we can see that the figures are quite high, actually, right? And in many countries of the Americas, disaster displacement happens over the year because of many different impacts, right? Floods and storms in particular are the hazards that are forcing people to move out of their homes. Human mobility in context of climate change, disasters, environmental degradation is also very diverse, right? It doesn't need to be a disaster. It can also support adaptation. But it is true that, as the IPC says, when there's low level of agency, low resources, low capacities, it has negative impacts, right? And that's where we're sort of joining the conversation on vulnerability, right? It can increase existing vulnerabilities that are depending on many drivers, right? We're talking about the situation of poor communities, rural communities, indigenous communities, specific situation of women and children. So all of these drivers are what creates scenarios in which climate change impacts and disasters exacerbate these difficult situations, right? And we end up with situations that Nicole was describing in terms of displacement, even protracted displacement, where people can or easily fall prey to exploitation, right? Because they have fewer resources, fewer networks to rely on. So what we're seeing is that when there's not enough coping capacities, the adverse impacts of climate change and disasters do increase vulnerability. And throughout the migration or the mobility process or the displacement process, we're seeing increased levels of vulnerability and of exposure to exploitations and other harmful practices.
Thanks, Pablo. And can you give us some examples of practically how you're seeing that through your work from particular countries that you're working in, or perhaps with particular vulnerable groups?
Right. No, that's a very good point. So we have had over the last year very visible cases of massive displacement. Right. We're seeing, for instance, the Caribbean after the 17 hurricane season, Central America after Eta and Iota in November 20. But as I said, this year, what struck me about the last reports is that there's a lot of disasters, smaller scale disasters that are driving displacement, right? In places like Brazil, in places like Colombia, we're seeing, the impacts of flood and storms displacing people almost on a daily basis, right? So we're seeing sort of this proliferation of risk that's compounded by limited integration into society, limited access to social protection, and so we're seeing in these places where, for instance, in Central America, displaced people may fall victims of trafficking, or may incur into smugglers because they're such in a desperate state, right? Because they've lost their income, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their housing, and they have fewer options for integration in their host communities. So in all of these areas, we're seeing an increase in vulnerability that's exacerbated by climate hazards and disasters.
Great, thank you. And thanks for kind of making that real with some examples. That's really helpful. Anna, can I turn to you now? I'd really like to hear from your perspective. What's your sense at the moment about the approach that businesses are taking towards these changing risks? Do you think that there's sufficient understanding of how much these risks are changing? And are businesses building these kind of longer term timeframes and these more kind of volatile scenarios into the way that they're working?
Thanks very much, Louise. And first, Pablo, wow, what a striking figure. 60.9 million of internally displaced. That's more than the population of England. Really striking. Yes, Louise, well, aware and knowledge, I mean, that's definitely starting, but for that to trickle through into actual processes, that's why we're here to talk about that. So a number of companies, of course, are used to conducting what we call human rights due diligence. In essence, having policies, practices, processes in place that pick up the risks to people in operations, in value chains, and doing something about it. What companies are less used to doing, however, is looking ahead to where the risk to people will be in the future, and then looking to take action now to mitigate those risks. So in other words, what we're seeing is that some of the short-termism that can be baked into human rights due diligence systems, is this a human rights impact today? Is it a severe human rights impact today? Does not equip companies to look ahead and to anticipate how these migration flows will manifest and how they will impact people in their value chain and in their own operations. So what we're starting to do, and Louise, you'll know this well because it came out also very clearly in our research for AIM Progress, is looking at how companies can take a longer term perspective to human rights due diligence. So essentially, what will the operating text look like for my business in 2030? What kinds of risks are on the horizon and will become risks to people then and will become severe then? And how do you do that? You need to bring in new data points. For example, you need to be relying more on science, what we know about the pathways of the future that the world could take. And then you need to be laying onto the science the human rights analysis. How can these pathways manifest into human rights impact? So essentially what I'm saying, Louise, is that this approach, this long-term perspective on salience, existence and severity, coupled with forward-looking scientific and human rights knowledge, together can equip companies to play a role today to mitigate these same human rights issues of tomorrow, which will happen. It's just a matter of time. And we know that companies are better equipped to mitigate them today rather than waiting for them to happen and then trying to do something about it then.
Yeah, great, thank you. Nicole, can I then ask you to build on what Anna's talked about? So your focus is clearly more in agriculture. We would expect to see the impacts of climate change, certainly for agricultural communities, to be greater. So from Rainforest perspective, are you seeing the businesses that you work with really understanding these risks and starting to take action on them?
Yes, absolutely we are. In terms of the risks that companies face, I think it can be useful to think about them in a couple of different categories. One way of looking at it is the risks that migrants face in sending areas, the areas that they come from, the areas where they live, but they feel forced to leave, and then those risks in receiving areas. So in terms of receiving areas, the agricultural lands that migrants migrate to in order to, oftentimes it's to have decent work or improve their livelihoods. There are really good tools out there to understand the likelihood of a company having migrant labor in its supply chain. So that's something that companies started doing a few years ago, not only in agriculture, but other sectors, migrant labor risks and how to address those. And Rainforest Alliance has a forced labor and child labor risk map, which incorporates information about migration, which we work with Ergon on, and that profiles risks for coffee, tea, cocoa, and bananas. And that's a methodology that's open source and can be adapted to other sectors. So we would welcome anyone who would like to use it or contact me about how to use it. But as Anna was saying, risks related to migrant workers alone doesn't give you that second piece of information that's also vital about what are the causes of that migration, and is it linked to climate change? And if so, what do we need to do about that climate change? There are not a lot of, I would say, well worked out tools yet that get to the level of specificity of really for a company to understand its risks of climate related migration in its supply chains. Deeper analysis needs to be done on that, and I know groups like Human Level are doing that. So that's really good to see that evolution. But there are things that companies can know. For example, in West African cocoa production, it's well known that migrant workers come from Burkina Faso and Mali to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire for the cocoa harvest. And they are among the most vulnerable people in the cocoa supply chain. They are driven by poverty in their home countries, but that also is scientifically shown to be affected. One of the root causes of that is the climate and land degradation situation in those home countries. Another salient issue linked to worker protection and climate change is the reality of wide-scale labor shortages in the sending areas. So simply put, in rural areas that have been heavily affected by climate change, the social protection systems have become eroded, social instability and unrest have increased, there's more violence and conflict, everything that Nicole kind of briefed us on initially. For example, in the coffee sector in Central America, this is really being seen in a way that's really affecting business. So farmers have a diminished ability to make a living. Their lands are increasingly unsuitable for even growing coffee, which leads them to not be able to hire workers or offer worse quality jobs. Workers leave to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Even outside the agriculture sector, they migrate away. And companies are very attuned to this because it affects their sourcing and availability of the crop. Many, companies that source coffee, for example, have been looking at climate risk maps and other projection tools for years to plan their sourcing and channel investments. But many times those kinds of activities don't necessarily encompass the human element. They will maybe look at what investments they need to make sure that they can ensure their coffee crop is available, but not necessarily what happens to those people's livelihoods or the working conditions of workers. There are other things that companies can do to address this, but I think we'll get to that later in the session.
Great, thanks very much, Rachel. I'm going to come back to you, Anna, if that's okay, just in terms of thinking about this. You've talked about what companies, yourself and Rachel have talked about what companies need to do to better understand the risks. You've talked a bit about the longer term timeframes. What do you think a responsible business response looks like to these changing risks? And what do businesses need to be doing to make sure that the opportunities they're offering for people in the receiving countries are decent work opportunities? Where does that start? What would you recommend?
Such a good question, Louise. Yes, what does it look like in practice? What do companies need to do? We described before the fact that human rights risk management needs to be grounded more in climate science and having more that sort of longer term perspective of climate science and how it will impact human rights. And we talked about having a longer term perspective on the risks to people and assessing salience. So that's sort of number one, because of course you need that knowledge. But really, I'm seeing this start to evolve, and I was just reflecting before this, what are really, the elements that you would want to have in place, right, to be future fit for the world of tomorrow today. So what I'm seeing is, human rights and climate need to have a seat at the table for business decisions, including those that are future looking. So we will start to see, and this will accelerate. We're already seeing it now. Companies want to de-risk, they want to move away from the risk factors, the extreme weather events cost them too much, they want to disengage, and they also want to move away from, if the climate is affecting commodity growth, we will start to have new sourcing strategies. This misses the point of responsible disengagement, and we need to have business, climate, and human rights at the table to look at where business is going and what we can do to bring a rights lens to that business decision making. That's number one. And then number two, companies need to think about the resilience. We've heard a lot, from the other panelists here about the resilience of farmers and workers and community members to climate change. So in practice, what it looks like, and Rachel touched upon a number of those elements already, living wage, living income, collective bargaining, trade unions, tackling discrimination. You can start with migrant workers in countries that are likely to move linked to climate and then sort of go outwards. So you can prioritize, but essentially, what are the actions you can take to build that resilience of the people in your value chain? We know that's not enough. We know that there's an enabling environment that needs to also look at this, and Pablo touched upon this as well. How can the company play a role to incentivize and push for a much stronger enabling environment? A little bit before, Nicole and Pablo, what you were saying, before sort of it gets too stretched, like what can we do now to try and build that enabling environment? Regulation, enforcement of regulation, social security, safety nets. This is where we read the beauty of collective, collaborative, creative leverage in the UNGPs comes in, of how we as buyers can play a role in policy issues that are so important, because our workers and our community members sit within that policy enabling environment. And the last thing I'd just say is sort of taking a step back and connecting this a bit more to responsibility when it comes to the company. This isn't a nice to do. Look, to put it really simply, we are in a system where Western companies have, since the Industrial Revolution began in the 1850s, they've grown. This is part of the economic development, right? But based on greenhouse gas emissions. And we now know that all these greenhouse gas emissions combined are impacting people, a lot of them further away from where these companies are based, and will impact people more and more. And so those who have not benefited from this economic development are those who will be harmed in the most severe way. So, there is reluctance, and I understand why, to tie companies' greenhouse gas emissions to human rights impacts because of retroactive remedy that this might entail. But I think we've got to just be a bit honest here and also think about that future role for companies when it comes to leaning in to play a role for those who will be impacted more severely by their greenhouse gas emissions, alongside, of course, a whole collective, which comes back to the collective responsibility. I don't want to suggest it's an individual one per se, but it's definitely this bigger collective conversation that we need to have.
Thank you, Anna. And I think you paint a really clear picture of what businesses need to do. I think it's interesting whether the mindsets of where they need to be to do that at the moment. I mean, that's part of what I'm really curious about. Rachel, if I can go back to you in terms of that idea of a responsible business response, what would you add to what Anna said in terms of what you think businesses need to be thinking about and be prepared to do in response to these changes in migration and those changes in potential exploitation?
Yeah, thanks. So endorse everything that Anna said. And to add a little bit of color to that, some of the things that we're seeing in the field that we're seeing working really well and are very promising. So one thing that companies can do, of course, is supporting farmer livelihoods through good purchasing practices. This can mean many things, like having stable long-term relationships with suppliers, thereby providing a livelihood stability for farmers in a volatile environment, paying fair prices. And in commodity agriculture, this can definitely mean more than the market price. Another is to support farmers' adaptation to climate change, making the necessary investments in the land to make the farm more resilient. These types of actions make farms more stable and better able to then provide decent work to farm workers. However, of course, that is not automatically the case. So it is really important that when these measures are implemented, they're always accompanied by some form of monitoring of labor standards. In receiving areas, I also wanted to mention, of course, I think in this particular forum, we're all familiar with responsible recruitment programs, and there are many organizations out there that run really strong ones. I'm thinking of labor rights organizations like Stronger Together and Verite and others, one of which we partner with, actually both of which we partner with. And we have a program in Mexico and Costa Rica with Stronger Together, where we're really building deep capacity of farm management and labor recruiters to coach them through setting up responsible recruitment systems and tools. So those are the kinds of investments companies can make in receiving areas where there are migrant workers. I also wanted to mention that companies should really be open to an innovation mindset. There's a lot of piloting happening right now in this whole space of the just transition. How do we bring together these issues and tackle root causes in a systemic way? For example, there are innovative programs around climate mitigation that seek to address climate change and provide decent livelihoods and working conditions simultaneously. We have a program in Cameroon where the community has set up a landscape management board with inclusive membership, women, indigenous people, etc. It makes bottom-up decisions about land use and land protection. And based on the decisions of that board, members of the community, including young people, are being trained to do carbon monitoring and data reporting. So these are jobs with good working conditions in which people feel they're contributing to the community's protection and prosperity. And this gives the jobs to the local people instead of what often happens in carbon monitoring projects is an external, probably global north-based organization will come in after the carbon has been sequestered or the carbon projects have happened and do the monitoring data collection.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Nicole, I'm going to come to you on this question now. If you can give us a slightly sort of different perspective. We've talked about, the responsible business response, but businesses don't, operate in isolation. You've also got the role of government. So from your perspective, how do governments need to facilitate and support and help businesses to react in a responsible way to these the changes in migration and the risks of exploitation?
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I think obviously businesses have a really important role to play, but I think there's a limit somewhat to what they can do if there's not a level playing field. And so we firmly believe, we've done some extensive research on looking at a number of different responses and approaches to addressing exploitation in supply chains. And we believe that governments have a really critical role that will enable businesses to be more effective. So what we're seeing at the moment, there's an unlevel playing field where responsible businesses are playing their part, but are find it difficult to compete. And particularly if you throw in additional pressures in the system, like what we're talking about, the impact of climate and conflict on labour supply, for example, we think it makes it difficult for responsible businesses to compete with those that are not committed to maintaining those standards. So we believe that there's a few key instruments, I think, that governments should be introducing that show the most promise at the moment. And they are, I think, speaking to what Anna said earlier, it's about due diligence approaches, but an enforced requirement to take due diligence approaches very seriously, so that all businesses, not just those that are choosing to be responsible, but all businesses actively identify and address risks of exploitation in their supply chains. And I think also to again, another point Anna made earlier is I think part of that is there's scope to predict emerging trends and to ensure that the supply chains and the processes enable businesses to adequately prevent finding exploitation in their supply chains. The other mechanism, which is also important in our opinion, and it shows some promise, it needs to be well targeted, but the introduction of import bans that prevent products made from forced labour and labour exploitation from entering markets and undermining competitiveness of responsible businesses. So they are sort of two ways to level the playing field and enable these efforts that we're talking about today to actually be effective and not undermine competitiveness.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And we could probably do a whole separate session on import bans and pros and cons with different views, I'm sure. Pablo, if I can come back to you, I mean, from the IOM perspective, do you see, in terms of responses to these risks, do you see businesses, governments, institutions like your own, civil society, working together yet on these issues? Do you see an opportunity there, even if perhaps it's not happening yet?
I thank you very much. No, I definitely do see an opportunity and the sort of platforms emerging for this to happen, right? Notably, a call for non-state actors to be more involved in mobility governance stemming from the Global Compact on Migration, but also the work on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? So I do see the platforms emerging, sort of, and we're not there yet, right? I think we're all very clear that we're not there yet, but it's increasing. I would like to also come back to what Nicole was saying, but also on the idea that governments have a role to play also in facilitating movements, right? And the idea that migration doesn't need to be a disaster, right? And we don't need to be reactive, right? I mean, there should be, processes for which people can move in a safe and regular manner, and which would benefit both those affected people and businesses, right? Because they would know they have the information, they have the conditions, right? And Rachel was mentioning Central America, where obviously the movement of labor is important in the coffee sector, right? And there's a important role to play for governments to facilitate movements and to put the conditions for these movements to happen in a manner that benefits all, right? It benefits them, but also governments themselves and the private sector, right? So I fully agree, Luis, that I mean, private and public and CSO partnerships are the way to go in saying, right, I mean, these movements happen, but let's make them happen in an orderly manner that can benefit us all, right? And there's a skill process to be addressed as well. What are the skills that are moving and what are the skills that are needed in both places, right? So all those sort of dialogues are important, and I think businesses have a key role to play in them, also noting that many of them will be themselves affected by the climate crisis, right? And the tourism sector in the Caribbean, agricultural sector in many places will be affected, and yeah, I mean, the labor markets will have to adjust accordingly.
Great, thank you, Pablo. So I'm going to come to each of you for your closing thoughts, please. We could talk for longer, but we're not able to. So a couple of questions. Either talk through your vision and your hope in this area. Pablo, you've taken us into that space of hope, which is great, and given us a positive angle on this, which is brilliant. But either your vision and your hopes in this area, or one step that you'd like to see companies taking. So what's the kind of first starting step, or the kind of main step you'd like them to take? Pablo, I'm going to come back to you if that's okay. I know we talked about the idea of social cohesion, and you had some examples of some really positive, case studies of communities coming together to support migrants coming into their communities as a result of climate and conflict. So maybe you could start there for that kind of vision, hope question for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a positive outlook for the end. But yes, indeed, I think that where we want to take the future is to a more cohesive integration of environmental and climate migrants. We know that to a large extent, migration is happening already, will continue to happen, will be partially driven by climate change, among other drivers. And we want to see inclusive societies, right? Societies where migrants can thrive, where they can contribute to adaptation, they can contribute to development, they have the skills they need, right? So in as much as we're already involved in this, and Nicole was saying this is not a future trend. I mean, this is happening now. But it's important that as of now, we look at preparing future migrants, preparing future cities, preparing future businesses, right? And think about what the future looks like for people to be moving due to climate hazards in particular, right? From rural areas to cities, from coastal areas inland, how that changes the productive phases of societies, right? And how businesses need to adapt. So I do see sort of promise in the sort of forward-looking manner and partnerships. And we're looking forward to having more private sector actors involved in this, I'm sure that governments will be obviously interested in this and looking forward to this cooperation.
Great, thank you. Nicole, then if I can come to you for your kind of final thoughts. I don't know if you can, I mean, your research is very focused on the scale of the challenge in front of us, but is there a vision or, a hope that you have in this area?
It's hard to distill it into one, but let me try. I think some of our broader research shows that these forms of exploitation are actually really hard to detect in supply chains. They have distinctive characteristics that make it challenging, and I think there's a level of alertness and engagement that's required in order to do so. That I think what is helpful in that space and to understand the impact of climate, and specifically going back to some of what Anna said about the specific risks that are quite predictable in lots of ways, looking to the future, that looking at trying to take an industry and sector specific approach and trying to really understand well what the specific areas of vulnerability are in those sectors, I think is a helpful and practical way to make it more accessible and easier to engage with something that is actually quite hard to do.
Great, thank you. Rachel, what are your thoughts on either a one step for companies or a vision or a hope or both, if you can squeeze them in?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we've seen at the macro level in recent years, especially lately, is civil society and other actors calling upon governments to look at the way climate finance is being spent. And so much of it is channeled towards what needs to happen to the land, right? And not enough to what has already happened to people, their human rights and their economic livelihoods, both what has happened and what will happen in the future. So just as we're looking at that, those calls to governments on a macro level, I would say the same thing to companies when they're looking at how to spend their sustainability dollars or euros or francs or whatever they are. We're seeing a lot of that going into climate mitigation efforts, right? Carbon credits and so on. And not enough is going into adaptation, helping the people have more resilient livelihoods and better human rights, whether they're people already affected by climate change or who will be affected in the future. So that would be my call to the business sector.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. And Anna, your final thoughts for us.
Thank you. Well, first, I love Rachel, what you said before about adopting an innovation mindset. So I want to make sure that's back on the table because it's such a good one. Taking a step back, I just got back from the Cobalt Congress. So I was chatting with a Cobalt trader about these things and, the forward-looking vision of business. And he was like, yes, Anna, it's all well and good, but I'm incentivized for short term. Like, I don't even look further than the week. So, how can I have this long-term vision in my business and my day-to-day, and let alone the business? And let's be honest that this is not how companies are structured. They are structured for very sort of short-term risk management, and we get it. Like, it's very hard to have that longer-term risk perspective, except for some issues where we know for sure it's going to be a business risk. And so we're not saying it's easy, but we're definitely seeing that it's starting to change. And I think I think just to acknowledge, for those who are listening, that we know that taking that longer term perspective is something that could be seen as sort of an add-on, right? Additional work when we're already really busy and scrambling with our day-to-day. And now, in addition, we're looking at more risks that are on the horizon. And what I would just say to that is, there was a session in Glasgow that really stuck with me, which was about this topic. And at the end of it, sort of the facilitator said, look, the reality is that this is the only time where we'll be able to take a rights-based approach to these topics, because every year that goes by, it becomes less and less possible and likely, because we will start to scramble more and more. And if you look at one of those UN figures of sort of 1.2 billion displaced by 2050 out of 9.8, so it's a big percentage, we will be in a very different world. And so the point here is that we can make it short term by saying, if you want to be business in the future, we need to be starting to think about this today, because these are real risks to the business in addition to risk to people and planet. The business case has been made, but for a long-term business that wants to be here in the future, for sure. If you want to be short-term, then it might be harder. And I think any company, who wants to thrive, they want to be here tomorrow. They want to be here in 2030. So that's what we're saying. If you want to be here in 2030, we're looking at the risks in 2030 and what you need to do today. That would be what I would leave people with.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So thank you so much to our panelists today, to Anna, Nicole, Pablo and Rachel. Thank you for all your ideas. We've had lots of things that definitely I'm going to go away thinking about, how do we not scramble around on this issue, end up being on the back foot when actually we can be on the front foot? How do we start building this into whatever type of organisation we are, start building this into our thinking today, how we're going to deal with these changes in migration, what steps can we take that will reduce exploitation for vulnerable people? And there are things that we can do. And leaving as well with Rachel's encouragement that we use innovative mindsets, and Pablo's call that we look at how we kind of work together. We've had great representation across sectors on today's panel. I've really enjoyed it and hope that you've all got something from it as well. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.